AI becomes much more present in pretty much all of our devices and all of our daily usage, we're going to need a lot more electrical power in order to actually use the AI. And the U.S. is much more power constrained than China. China has twice as much electrical capacity. This year, they'll build about 500 gigawatts of solar capacity, and the U.S. will build 50. China has 30 nuclear power plants under construction. The U.S. has 0. And, if the bottleneck on AI becomes more electrical production, then China is much more ahead here. And there's a lot of top researchers working in American labs who are Chinese nationals who attended Chinese schools. And it could be that, they don't like San Francisco. They don't like Donald Trump's policies on immigration. They don't like his rhetoric, and they decide to repatriate back to China. And so I feel like the U.S. definitely has a lead in all sorts of technologies, but it's many fewer than the past. And this lead may diminish. And not even in the crucial area of AI is the U.S., I think, necessarily going to have the advantage forever.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Founders in Arms podcast with me, Imad Akum, co-founder and CEO of Mercury.
And I'm Raj Suri, co-founder of Lima and Tribe. And today we have with us Dan Wang, who is a research fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and also the author of this amazing book, Breakneck, I have in front of me right here, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And I've been following Dan for a long time. He's been writing these very interesting annual letters from China, and I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley read those and, just trying to understand what's happening with China. And so Dan has kind of been seen as, I think, a China whisperer, or just like telling us, what's happening in China. He's been, kind of the West's understanding of China, I think, for several years now. And so finally, this is your first book, Dan, is that right?
Right.
Right. Well, welcome to the show. We're very excited to have you here. And would love to maybe start with, what was the genesis behind this, first of all, like your career as like a China, someone who's really deeply understanding China. Like, is that something intentional, or has that just happened as you've kind of, had opportunities in your career?
I think most great books begin as accidents. And I'm not saying I wrote a great book, but mine was certainly an accident. And I had been working in San Francisco in tech up until 2016. And then I decided to go to China I was recruited to be a technology analyst at a investment research firm named Gavkal Dragonomics. And I moved to Hong Kong, then Beijing, then Shanghai between the years 2017 to 2023 to mostly study China's technology growth. And it turned out to have been a pretty momentous time in retrospect, that I lived through the first trade war conducted by Trump, something that morphed into a tech war. China was gaining all sorts of capabilities and all sorts of technologies. Xi Jinping was growing more repressive. And the centerpiece of my life was zero COVID, 3 years in which I lived through the entirety of China's pandemic controls. And after that, I thought that we're thinking about the U.S.-China competition using these 19th century political science terms like socialist and capitalist and neoliberal, and I found them all pretty boring, and these are not very interesting terms. And I just wanted to create an inventive and playful new framing to think about the U.S. and China.
And that framing is like this engineering society versus, lawyerly society, right? It runs as a through line throughout your book, right? That's kind of the framing that you created, yeah. Imad and I are both engineers. I think, we both probably read this book. I noticed, this is the first question I want to ask, but I noticed that you talk about all the downsides of having engineers run societies and run governments. In Silicon Valley, it's very common for engineers to run companies. And most companies are red. In fact, it's seen as a good thing for engineers to run companies versus, the business people, right? The non-technical people. I think you point out that there's a lot of downsides with that. What do you think some of the downsides are for engineers to be running things?
Yeah, well, I think it is good for companies to be run by engineers. That is, I would say, almost unambiguously positive. And, you don't want lawyers running startups. That would be weird. But I mean, I think when a company fails, for the most part, it is not that catastrophic for the economy, for society. Most of the time, these dissolutions would be pretty orderly, without broader effects. But if you have a government that is run by engineers, imagine how bad the downside could be. So, I mean, I write a lot about how the Chinese are not made up of only physical engineers. I think building a lot of stuff is in general pretty good. I think they're fundamentally also social engineers, in which they treat the society and the people as yet another engineering project to be torn down and remolded. And so I spend some time covering the detention of ethno-religious minorities in Tibet and Xinjiang, and I really focus on the one-child policy as well as zero COVID, in which the number is right there in the name, right? There's no ambiguity about what one-child policy could possibly mean. And this was something where it was a missile scientist that kind of decided to convince the leadership that China, in their view, had an overpopulation problem by the late 70s, and there was a simple, elegant mathematical solution to this, namely the one-child policy. Zero COVID, again, was a very literal-minded application of trying to prevent the spread of the virus, and they became so literal-minded about all of this that they didn't care if you needed dialysis treatment. They didn't care if you needed chemotherapy treatment, which are probably more life-threatening than the COVID pandemic. And so, but they only cared about the controlling the pandemic. And so here's where you don't want engineers to be fully literal-minded in running the entire society. What do you think of that?
I guess like on the other side, there has been, since the 1980s, like China's brought more people out of poverty than I think any other country's managed. So obviously there's the benefits of the engineering society, and now China in many ways is superior to the US when it comes to making things, and maybe in every way it's superior. So there's definitely like benefits to it. One thing that like struck me, and I don't know if you covered this in the book, is like, why is it that like in many ways America was the engineering society from like the 40s to maybe the 60s or 70s, and like it's not obvious that kind of a socialist society should end up as an engineering society. So like what is it about like I guess China that like ended up being an engineering society and propelled kind of engineers to the top? Was it just a quirk of fate? And then I guess the reverse, like what is it about America that's like lost its engineering prowess?
Yeah, I think that it is not only a quirk of fate that the Chinese became so engineering. I mean, this really accelerated in the 1980s when Deng Xiaoping took a look at the wreckage of the Mao years, decided that Mao was a warlord, a romantic, a poet. And what is the opposite of a poet? Well, obviously, it's an engineer. And so let's get rid of the poet and let's replace them all with engineers. And so they had a very conscious effort to promote a lot of engineers into the top ranks of the Chinese leadership. And they obviously had a lot of heritage and learning from the Soviet Union, which really was excellent in a lot of heavy industry and a lot of sciences for a while. And by the year 2002, every single member of the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest ruling echelon of the Communist Party, all 9 members had degrees in engineering. And I think that's pretty remarkable. But I also
Were they also inspired by Japan at the time?
Yes, they were inspired by Japan, but the Japanese actually industrialized through people, I understand, who had actually more legal training backgrounds. And so, but I would say that the Soviet influence was the more decisive influence on China at the time. And so I would also say that, you can maybe trace some degrees of the engineering state to older imperial Chinese society. What is China really well known for? Things like the Great Wall as well as the Grand Canal. So a fortification system in one case and a water management system. China's political system for a while had this sense of being defined by the exam system, which, they just gave everyone an exam. And even though that wasn't perfect, and even though a lot of the exam had a lot of poetry, you can argue that it was a fairly technocratic state for a while and fairly meritocratic for quite a long while as well. And I think the U.S. definitely used to be a proto engineering state itself. I think that I would say that basically for about 100 plus years, from the middle of the 19th century to middle of the 20th century, the U.S. certainly built a lot. Canal systems, skyscrapers in Chicago and Manhattan, railway systems, the highway system, Manhattan project, Apollo missions. These are all like incredible achievements by the American state. And I think there was this broad consensus within the elites for most of the 19th century that America had vast territories and new immigrants arriving on boats every day. And yeah, definitely this territory should be knit up with excellent infrastructure. And so they certainly built a lot. But everything changed throughout the 1960s, in which the lawyers really took over. They were regulators, they were litigators. They were upset that urban planners like Robert Moses was ramming highways through New York City. The Department of Agriculture was spraying DDT and pesticides absolutely everywhere. And so they had a reaction, and all of these law students starting then decided that they needed to constrain the government. And I think that is part of why we haven't had any building today.
It's really fascinating. Kind of societies go through this pendulum, right? And we're kind of seeing this in real time, how this is unfolding. But, U.S. as an advanced, developed society went through the pendulum that probably China is going to go through to some degree, where it builds up and then it reaches all these environmental issues. And then people decide that the environmental issues and the quality of life issues are more important than the building, right? Because the infrastructure is already built to some degree to maybe pass a threshold, of acceptance. And then they go the other way, where environmental issues become more important, quality of life issues become more important, and then you forget how to build, and then you realize, oh, we haven't built in a while. Can we go and recover that skill set? And the question is, will the U.S. go back to that building mindset, or will it just have been lost forever?
Right. And I think, the metaphor of the pendulum is that it swings to and fro. And I am not certain that the U.S. is going to be able to swing back into solving present problems. Right now, the U.S. has a housing shortage in big cities like San Francisco and New York and Boston. Its mass transit system is deeply broken. Even in New York City, where it's pretty functional, the subway system is just so loud. So dirty. And so, I think that it needs to fix that too. Train systems are kind of broken. The manufacturing base is broadly broken. And so, I would like for the pendulum to swing back a bit. We don't have to repeat the mistakes of the 1950s and the 1960s. But I feel quite strongly also that the lawyers are a very entrenched lobby. They are still interested in solving the problems in the 1960s rather than solving the problems of today. And they are going to be a very powerful restraint on the pendulum from swinging back.
One thing about lawyers, which is different from engineering societies, is like lawyerly societies to some extent are like self-reinforcing. Like if you get the rules to be complicated enough, the only people that understand it are lawyers, and the only people who can make new laws are the same lawyers. And there's just like when I moved to America, I'm from the UK, I was surprised at how many lawyers are politicians. Like that's not the case in the UK. Mostly it's people from all walks of life. And it kind of makes sense because the rules are so complicated that the only people who can like go make a new law are lawyers. So that's the thing that I think is like kind of tricky, that like how do you undo a system where like it's the only people that understand it are people who are like kind of entrenched in the system.
Yeah. I think that is definitely a self-reinforcing loop, and the elites are very good at reproduction. I wrote this book substantially from the Yale Law School, and it really feels like the kids who go to Yale Law are like much more ambitious than undergrads at Stanford. Maybe that's not an apples to apples comparison, but folks who attend Yale Law are just are really nice. They are very smart, but they are defined, I think, by their ambition, and many of them want to seek public office. And I think
are they more ambitious, or is it just a different kind of ambition? Because I feel like Stanford undergrads, their ambition is like, we'll do this tech thing or whatever, whereas like maybe the Yale Law ambition is like, we'll become presidents.
Yeah, well, I think that the president is more ambitious than the startup, but I take your point that, there's different sorts of ambition. And many of them view a JD from Yale Law as their ticket into the White House, either as a staffer or as the president. And there is kind of this inbuilt, pathway for law students to go clerk for federal judges, go clerk for the Supreme Court justices. And, no such pathway really exists for engineers to enter the government in any sort of an obvious way. And so the elites, I think, have very much captured the political system, lawyerly elites.
And it's funny because people like J.D. Vance, right? Becomes an elite, goes to Yale Law, but then will hark on his upbringing as that he's not elite, he's a man of the people, right? I guess you probably see a bit of that in Yale Law. People remembering the roots when they get into politics, or trying to emphasize that. I guess you seem somewhat skeptical that the U.S. would go back to building, but there does seem to be a political movement. I mean, to emphasize that, right? Like there is ultimately it's we the people who can decide whether we want to cut the red tape, cut the laws, and go back to a society where we build more. And that seems to be, a bipartisan consensus now to some degree. Or you see the book Abundance by Ezra Klein, who I understand, but and you mention him in the book as well. But there's this kind of movement, maybe even on the left, to maybe say, hey, before we were more focused on environmental stuff, maybe now we should be focused more on building. Do you kind of see this kind of emerging?
Perhaps. I want to be optimistic. I think that there is more will to push this very big boulder that is blocking our way. But though there's more will, the boulder is still very big, and I think that is what I take to be the lawyerly society. That it is the lawyers are still pretty firmly entrenched. That it is really difficult to convince voters to say, well, maybe we need fewer procedural rules to give everyone their chance in court. Maybe we need to, not be so obsessed with 4,000-page environmental reviews, because then they just hear, well, you hate the environment. And I think, yes, there is some sort of an effort to build more by both the left and the right, but I don't see it as being quite bipartisan exactly, because the left and the right don't agree on what are the problems of underbuilding and how to fix it. So within the left, there is kind of this view that the U.S. needs better state capacity in order to expand supply, whereas the right is more inclined, I think, to say something like, well, it's all the union's fault and we should get rid of all of this DEI. And so they don't have, I think, fundamental agreement on the means, and I think I'm not sure that they have fundamental agreement on the ends either.
What's kind of interesting is if you look at China's history, it feels like China flourishes whenever the government kind of gets out of the way a little bit.
Yes, I agree.
And there's a sudden boom, and then the government interferes, and then it slows down, which to some extent people could say happened recently. And I feel like in this conversation, it's kind of similar in America. I just feel like if the government got out of the way and there was less rules for building housing in San Francisco, I think capitalism would go build a bunch of houses in San Francisco. The prices are high enough. We would figure it out. So it does feel like that's what we need, which is maybe a little easier to do on localized places, right? There was a new mayor in San Francisco, and there's also a new board of supervisors, and maybe in localized places we can have that movement, even if it's harder on federal things.
Maybe. I think that the U.S. has been really good at building data centers. I mean, it's pretty incredible, the build out. I think that's positive. But at the end of the day, it is still going to be a political decision in San Francisco, even whether to build new housing. And who knows, maybe the boulder will mobilize a new slate of supervisors and kick this lot out and get back to the NIMBYism once more. And I think it is, I think there are some private railways being built in the US. I think there's a line in Florida that is being built by a private company. But in general, most of these things have to be done by the government. The government, will not let a private company build New York City subways. They will not build like much more substantial rail. So I think that our best hope has to be also to say that, we need to improve state capacity such that we're able to do something like, actually build California high-speed rail.
Dan, one thing you mentioned earlier about China being engineering society and the downsides of that, it strikes, Imad and I know lots of engineers. We know there's a huge difference between good engineers and bad engineers, and good engineering design and bad engineering design. It strikes me that the problem in China, a lot of it is bad engineering design. Like, they don't have like inbuilt feedback loops for all of their policies, and like when you design a one-child policy, like not getting the right feedback, not knowing how to react to that, once you have a policy, you can have a policy in theory. And we all know, engineers have lots of theories. Sure, we have a lot of scientific theories. But once that theory hits reality, as founders, we know that you have to react to that. And it feels like in China, the feedback loops are broken completely. And, the government just doesn't get the right amount of feedback from the people. And of course, that's the problem of being an authoritarian state, but it's also a problem in engineering design.
I agree. And I think this is where I acknowledge the limits of the engineering state argument, which is to say that actually fundamentally they are authoritarians, and that really matters. And, that these are actually at this point now governance issues, that they are not very good at surfacing information often, and they're often not very good at, implementing things and having good feedback. The irony of the one-child policy was that it was designed by one of China's top cybernetics experts. And cybernetics is all about feedback loops. And then they just said, okay, well, we're just going to do a simple, blunt solution that incorporates no feedback, and it's just going to be the way it is. And so, yes, definitely, I think a lot of that is, bad design, but I think that is mostly problems with the authoritarian state and interacting with bad engineering design on top of it.
Thanks for acknowledging that. So I appreciate that. I can sleep better at night knowing that my profession hasn't screwed up China. Yeah.
I guess one thing that America often points to right now is that, at least with semiconductors, we're in front and we're in front in AI. Where do you think we're going to end up with kind of semiconductors? Do you think Taiwan, I guess, will it fall in Chinese influence, or will they just figure it out? Is this something that America can continue to be ahead on?
Yeah, I think that the US is still in the lead in several key technologies. Chips is one, and aviation is another, where Airbus and Boeing are still much stronger than China's aviation champion, COMAC. And arguably AI, the US is ahead. But just generally, I think that the U.S. has lost its lead in a lot of different technologies, especially in manufactured goods, and perhaps its lead in AI, as well as chips, has also been declining. In part because Intel has messed up, not so much due to China, but because of its own strategic blunders. And NVIDIA and AMD really have to go through Taiwan for all of their chips. And I suspect that the Chinese will continue making better and better chips, and that will continue to threaten the profitability of American chip companies, especially something in memory like Micron. And even in something like AI, it's obvious that the U.S. has the lead right now. It has the better reasoning models, it has all the compute capacity, et cetera. But I also worry that, if AI becomes, much more present in pretty much all of our devices and all of our daily usage, we're going to need a lot more electrical power in order to, actually use the AI. And the U.S. is much more power constrained than China. China has twice as much electrical capacity. This year, they'll build about 500 gigawatts of solar capacity, and the U.S. will build 50. China has 30 nuclear power plants under construction. The U.S. has 0. And, if the bottleneck on AI becomes more electrical production, then China is much more ahead here. And there's a lot of top researchers working in American labs who are Chinese nationals who attended Chinese schools. And it could be that, they don't like San Francisco, they don't like Donald Trump's policies on immigration, they don't like his rhetoric, and they decide to repatriate back to China. And so I feel like the US definitely has a lead in all sorts of technologies, but it's many fewer than the past. And this lead may diminish. And not even in the crucial area of AI is the US, I think, necessarily going to have the advantage forever.
I guess there's many people in Silicon Valley that think AI is everything, and that like as long as America can continue being a leader in AI, everything else like comes secondary to that because it'll lead to other innovation and productivity and things like that. I don't know if I'm like 100% sold on it, but let's just say if you also believe that, what would you change in American policy? Like, would you just like double down on nuclear? What would be like the one thing you would be like, hey, we should just like do this if we really want to stay ahead in AI?
Yeah, well, I think they have they're doing everything they could to bet that AI is the future. They are building more. They're trying to get some nuclear started, but they're also not. Trump hates solar and wind. He calls it the scam of the century. And so I would, at least not block new solar and wind. I would do more on geothermal. I would do more on the construction of transmission lines. And so to really just try to solve that bottleneck. And then I would try to do much better to retain foreign researchers. I mean, the Trump administration may not be forever very friendly towards a lot of Chinese researchers. We know they were very unfriendly towards Korean engineers who were trying to build a plant in Georgia, and then they were deported and humiliated in chains to leave. And so I think this is where U.S. policy could get a lot smarter if you accept the premise that AI is everything. And I don't buy that premise. I think that, there is no one technology that is going to determine the future of the world and geopolitics forever. I think that case is pushed by some folks in Silicon Valley, and I'm sure they genuinely believe it, but it just sounds so apocalyptic. And, it's almost like a religious case, which I find very, very odd. So I'm not sure I buy that.
It's hard to justify raising $1 billion without a case like that on like a seed valuation.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we got to drink some of the Kool-Aid, right, to get to justify the capital going into these companies. But yeah, I think the AI stuff, first of all, doesn't make sense to me. Imad, I think, was pretty gentle in his description, but like a lot of the AI models are going to be open sourced or, open, they're going to be easy to copy anyways. We saw DeepSeek already do that, but it's not, the model themselves is not, like, what does being ahead in AI even mean? Like, I don't understand. Like it could be being, I would say the bigger part about AI is actually robotics. That is going to be the most important part of AI because that's actually going to do real work. Whereas a lot of the current like applications for AI, like Sora 2, like is that really productive technology? But robotics is actually going to, you're going to have all these factories which you talk about in your book, which are like dark factories, I think you call them, which are completely operated by robots. Those are the future, right? When robots can do a lot of the farming for you, that's the future, right? And that's where you have true abundance, where robots can help you build a house. That's the future. So that's going to be the best application of AI, and it feels like China's going to be way ahead on that front, and the U.S. could be really very much left behind if we can't build good robots.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is another important case. The US is much more of a services-driven economy. We're going to use AI to make better PowerPoints, make more lawsuits with which to sue people. They're going to be using AI to build the robots, build drones, build munitions, build electronics. And I feel like even if they're behind in some way, and I agree with you, Raj, that what does it even mean to be ahead? It's kind of unclear. But in their use, they may just get better use out of all of their specializations.
I do mostly agree with you guys. I'll just steelman a little bit further the kind of OpenAI Anthropic argument, which is like intelligence is kind of upstream of all of these things. And if you are way better at intelligence and you eventually reach AGI, you could maybe deliver better robotics and do all of that in a much better way. I'm not sold on it. I'm just saying that's how they would argue it.
Yeah. I mean, the time scale to develop that intelligence, though, is much shorter than the time scale to develop robots, I feel. Like the actual robots to implement the intelligence is actually, I think, the bottleneck in, not...
And there's actually like a perverse case where like laws actually get more complicated because the AIs are like writing the laws and reading the laws and doing the lawsuits. And like actually you could have a much worse lawyerly society when you're not like bottlenecked by humans, like kind of administrating the laws.
And if intelligence is everything, why doesn't Silicon Valley run America? Why is it still Washington, D.C.? And I think that's...
Hey, that's a good point, Dan.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems it doesn't, and the universities, right? The universities definitely don't run America. They're being attacked by America to some degree.
I mean, I guess you could argue Silicon Valley does run the economy of the US. And historically, we just didn't care about running the country, whereas like that turned out to be a bad idea. But it does kind of go back to your previous point where you were like, the Yale students are more ambitious, but like I think Silicon Valley actually thinks of ambition as like we run the economy, whereas like, the lawyers think of ambition as we run the country, which is like a very interesting kind of difference.
When it comes to AI, all the money that's going into it, and the regulation piece that you mentioned, Imad, is really, really important. I am sensing on the left there is an increasing movement, of anti-AI populism. Basically, people like, including Ezra Klein, who is more center left, but you have people like Bernie and stuff. Bernie just came out and said, AI is going to take all your jobs, and I'm seeing this to be like a mainstream argument. And I can see it actually being on the right as well, because as AI does take away jobs, AI will take away some jobs. And the job market is terrible right now. The labor market is terrible. The political backlash will grow. And it'll become more politically acceptable to, regulate AI and prevent it. I mean, we already see some instances where Trump, like, for example, blocked the automation of the ports, right? Where there's an anti-automation movement. And that is, I think, a real issue. You can be as smart as you want. You can develop the best AGI, but if the society decides to regulate it, you're going to have a problem.
And also the eventual point about Dan's like lack of electricity production is that AI will consume more electricity, which is going to increase the cost of electricity. And then there will also be a backlash against that.
Yes. And there already is starting to be a backlash because electricity prices are rising in Virginia, where all the data centers are. So,
Dan, you've studied this. This is something that Imad and I struggle with on this podcast all the time. Like, AI is going to have this huge disruption potentially. We believe it will. We don't know the timescale. But like, how will society react to that disruption? And how should it react? And how do you think it actually will react?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I have anything more useful than conventional fears and hopes. It is pretty striking that Sora 2 is out now, and I've spoken to people who say that their AI-generated selves are not distinguishable by family members, and you can pretty obviously see some abuse out of this, creation of incredible misinformation, right? And so, what is going to happen with that? Why are we using these tools to make it really easy to fake hyper-realistic videos? I mean, is this really what society needs? I find that strange. And there's all sorts of other ways in which I think, obviously we can debate whether AI creates jobs on net or destroys jobs on net, what is going on here. But, I guess obviously there's tremendous opportunity, but at a first approximation, I am more fearful of, these video generation. It's not as if our information ecosystem is all that healthy today. But with the introduction of these new tools, are we going to react well? And, because that the electricity, that the U.S. is underinvested in electricity production, that power prices are rising for residents of Virginia. And so, you can pretty easily imagine some sort of a political backlash here because voters are pretty clear in not liking, higher and higher prices. So, are we going to be able to solve that very easily without being able to trigger a backlash? I don't know. This is where, the politics and the regulations really do matter, as you say, Raj.
Dan, I have a bit of a meta question. It's cool that you wrote this book and had all these new ideas, and obviously you've been writing these letters. Like, what's your process for coming up with new ideas and new ways of kind of reframing the way people think about things? That seems like a hard thing to do, but you've done it consistently.
Well, maybe the dirty secret here is that I'm more lawyerly than engineering. Um, my undergrad, I have my bachelor's. That's all I have. I was a philosophy major, and I like to read. I like to travel. I like to eat. And in the midst of eating, traveling, and reading, and eating, I think when you do all of these sort of things, you eventually get all sorts of ideas, and I simply write them down. I think I try to be a reasonably articulate writer, and then I create a narrative around something, and I'm much more interested in being provocative and offering a case rather than proving or establishing anything. I don't think I want to be all that precise about anything. I just want to be fun and playful and giving people something more to think about. And that's been my approach for a while.
Is there a particular kind of reading that you feel inspires you the most?
I certainly enjoy reading novels mostly, and then novels and history. Those are the kinds of books I most enjoy reading.
It's funny you mentioned that. I mean, Imad's a big reader himself. He loves traveling and eating too. We both are like that. So even though we're in different backgrounds, we're more on the technical side. I think we share probably that in common. I think we have plenty of ideas too, right?
Dan said eating twice, so he really likes his food.
I'm pretty sure I saw you eat twice, Imad, last time.
Yeah, that is interesting. Is there when you've done kind of this traveling and reading, is there like a particular thing that you focus on, like when you're reading, to go like, oh, like is it that you're looking for parallels with like modern society for the past, or is there like something that you're particularly drawn to?
Well, I think when I'm reading, I feel like maybe another difference with me is that I just feel highly opinionated, and a lot of my writing is driven by this idea that is summarized by the meme that someone is wrong on the internet, and I feel like I have a better narrative to be able to prove. And I also want to stress that the traveling and the eating are very important components because, as soon as you travel somewhere new, especially in like, parts of Asia, which I find much more vibrant than the US and Europe. They're much more dense. Generally, they have better food, definitely over the US, not necessarily over Europe. But once you start doing all of these sort of things and you take in the pleasures of the food and you take in the stimulation of visiting a new place, you start to get more comparative and you start to have more ideas. And that is just walking around is definitely a giant part of my writing process.
Super cool. So I don't know if you know this, Dan, but obviously you don't. But I spent a lot of time in China. I had factories in China in my last company, and my wife is from China. So one thing I really liked about your writing is that how evocative it was about your life in China. And I think China is a beautiful place. It's a really amazing place to travel. There's so much variety there. Most people think of China as a monolith. It's as you mentioned very articulately in your book. There's a huge variety of types of people, regions, cuisines, and it's a very, it's an amazing place to travel. And one of my biggest, I would say, frustrations is that more people in the U.S. don't travel to China, and actually many people in the U.S. Like, Emad, have you ever been to China?
I have, but not for a long time. When I was like 20 or something. Do you feel like, Dan, like, I guess some of the concepts you talk about are probably controversial in China. Do you feel like safe traveling in China after like writing this book and kind of saying these things?
I hope so. So I will. My prior visa has lapsed, and in a couple of months, I will apply for a new visa. Give them some time to think about it, whether I could be allowed in. And no surprises on either side. But if they let me in, I would definitely love to go and experience all of this great variety, the great nature, the diversities in cuisines. It's just a lot of fun to be over there.
Yeah. I'm not outspoken about China at all, but I don't know if I feel safe traveling to China. Raj is like the thing I would say. Like, there's so many places I can travel to in the world, so I don't know if I'd want to take the risk, but maybe I'm just paranoid about it.
And my view on that, I mean, yes, there's definitely been some times where China's cracked down on foreigners, and there's definitely been a couple of bad stories, but by and large, it's been okay. And you have to kind of go at a time where they're not in this mode of like, cracking down on foreigners. You have to pick your times, I think. That's my view on it.
No, how do you pick a time? That's who knows when there
Yeah, plus it could
Yeah.
change.
some sort of a blow up.
I mean, especially now that America and China are just in this like continuous like tension kind of space, it's hard to like know it's safe.
Yeah, but if they're trying to do a trade deal and they like, do something with an American, it's not going to be good, right, for them. So like there's, like even a single American in trouble in China, like, or taken by the government, that's going to be a big problem, right? So like I think there is a real risk. I mean, I think there's some downside protection on that is the way I would think of it. But there's certainly times when America and China are like really at loggerheads. You don't want to be going there. But yeah, I think it's worth the risk because like you and I take a lot of risk, but we're in the risk taking business. But China, I would still advocate everyone read Dan's book, and his letters, which I think talk about the beauty of China in a way that I think in the U.S. is very difficult to access. It's really hard to understand how amazing China is. Like, I mean, everyone here is fascinated by Japan. A lot of people have been to Japan and experienced the beauty of Japan. But I would say China is, at its own level, right? It's comparable, I think, to Japan. It's just, if you're listening to the podcast, think about going to China. It's a great place.
I'm glad you said that, Raj, not me.
Yeah.
Dan, you said you're often contrarian and you disagree with people. I quite like this Peter Thiel question. I don't know if you've heard it before, but what important truths do very few people agree with you on?
I think that it is important to acknowledge that China has done amazing things in lifting 1.4 billion people out of extreme poverty, lifting a few hundred million of those into the middle class and a few million people into the global rich elite. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that China has grown more repressive in some more novel ways, especially over the past decade, and that the Communist Party over the past 7 decades has visited these totally insane traumas upon the population, namely the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, one-child policy, and maybe you should throw in zero COVID in there as well. And so I think that, for me, one important thing as a China analyst is to acknowledge both traumas visited upon the people by the Communist Party, as well as the fact that people have grown much, much richer. And that is just a fact. This duality is something I keep in my mind at all times.
I think one thing that people also don't realize, you mentioned the book, is like the difference between rural and urban lives. I have also had a chance to experience that. My wife's family's from a rural area.
Where?
But, in Liaoning province in the northeast. Which is as rural as it gets. It's not a rich, area either. You mentioned traveling around, like I believe it was in the south, right? Also a very poor area. And the standard of life in those areas is still very good, And the Chinese Communist Party has actually done a really good job of like providing a good standard of life to people who were, would otherwise be very, very poor. And the salary, Imad, you might not know this, salary is there. I learned it just from experience. $500 to $1,000 a month is a good salary, in these places, and they have a good standard of life. Like I lived there for a while, and I had great internet, great water, great power, great food. Even like you can get like great Sichuan food now in like Northeast, which is kind of remarkable. And you can order almost anything on JD, right? Like on the Amazon there, and get it next day delivered. So like the supply chains are incredible. This is in the mountains, right? So, it is really remarkable. And I think, Dan, one of the most powerful parts in the book that I got from that is like how redistribution doesn't need to be about cash. It can be about, infrastructure and providing these incredible supply chains and, power, roads, all these things. It's something that India has not done well, I would say, like, and still struggles with today. But I thought that was a really powerful point in your book.
Yeah, this is redistribution with Leninist characteristics, in which the state decides that what the people want is better infrastructure and better logistics, and to which I say sometimes, I mean maybe even often, like yes, people do feel really good about getting new subway lines, high-speed rail, drone delivery into the mountains or whatever else, and these things all seem pretty cool, and they are pretty cool. Better bridges to tie people into better markets. That's all real. But I think right now there are going to be limits, if those limits haven't been met already yet, that maybe people just want a little bit more actual redistribution, because having yet another bridge is not going to meaningfully improve their lives in any sort of a big way.
Yeah, and you talked about this kind of core, I don't know if it's a contradiction, but core kind of tension with China about like, hey, they've lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but they've also had these like somewhat insane social experiences that have like traumatized people. Is there a core tension that you could speak to in America, like where like these similar kind of like two sides that like are hard to hold in your head?
Yeah, I think that for me, one thing that is important about the U.S., maybe this could all be distilled down to San Francisco and Silicon Valley, is that America, at a first approximation, doesn't look like it is failing in every way. Maybe it is true that a lot of things don't work, but Silicon Valley has created these trillion-dollar companies in a way that no one else has been able to, right? And that is substantial and that is real. But the problem, the essential duality difference between the U.S. In the U.S. is that California and New York work really well for the rich, and I think they don't work all that well for the middle class. The rich have these giant homes in Atherton. They don't really have to deal with the dysfunctions of Caltrain or BART. They have their drivers take them around. And I would, really wish that America worked better, not only for trillion-dollar companies and not only for the very wealthy, but for the many who do need to take public transit, Muni and BART and Caltrain into work, that these train services could be cleaner and more frequent, and that, there's actually jobs for people in a really big way. And so America can't be, I think, a great power if it is only wealthy for over the longer run.
I had one last thing, actually, Dan. So when you go to Japan right now, you'll see it feels like it's stuck in the 80s, right? Like it's all this infrastructure built in the 80s. I go to Tokyo, it's like a retro city, right? Do you think that's going to happen to China at some point? Like it's one thing to build up everything as a developing country. It's another thing to like refresh your infrastructure and keep it, up to date, which is very difficult, right? What do you think of is that China going to be stuck in the 2010s, for example?
Yeah, possible. I think that is quite a possible scenario. I mean, for me, the city that seems really stuck is Hong Kong. It's been really stuck in the 90s. And I mean, Taipei also. But I feel like China is a little bit more intent on refurbishing. They are more serious engineers. They sort of do minimal redistribution, and most of what they do is to prove their legitimacy to the people. They build these gigantic dams, these gigantic roads and bridges, and that is how they demonstrate as an alternative to democracy, as an alternative to other forms of growth. This is how they demonstrate their prestige, and I think that China is less likely to appear stuck than Japan. But let's track back in 20 years and see.
We'll have you back in 20 years.
Excellent. Very good.
All right. Yeah, great having you, Dan. This has been fantastic. And yeah, let's definitely get together in the Bay Area sometime.
Excellent. That sounds great.
Yeah, and everyone should read Dan's book, Breakneck.
Yeah, Breakneck. Yep. Drone delivered to your house.
Thanks everyone for listening. Please leave us a review on whatever channel you're listening on. Makes a big difference to the algorithm and to the success of the show. And see you all next week.